Not every nightmare ends when you wake up. Some nightmares live on like a second skin, clinging to every breath, every habit, every moment that seems ordinary on the surface. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the memory of someone who died, but the sickening sense that you were led to believe they died, that the pain was real, that life had already accepted a loss too permanent to undo. Vanessa had been living inside that feeling for weeks, as if every step she took was on broken glass, as if each day was a battle to keep herself from screaming at the injustice of it all. She had sworn she wouldn't search for answers anymore, because answers often only make you die one more time. And yet fate chose the exact kind of harmless afternoon, no rain, crowded streets, the cafe still smelling of warm pastries, to reopen her wound with a blade made of ice. And that blade wore Doug's face. Not a photograph, not a rumor, not a ghost conjured by imagination, but a living figure close enough for Vanessa to hear her heart crack inside her chest, clear enough for every scrap of reason she'd clung to for survival to collapse like a sandcastle. Vanessa stepped out of the cafe like someone waking from a long nightmare, her heart still flinching every time her eyes drifted toward the road that had stolen Doug from her. She had only meant to pass by, only meant to draw one deep breath and remind herself that it was over, that pain eventually cools into something bearable, but fate chose that moment to mock her. At the far end of the street, amid faceless strangers and rushing cars, a familiar silhouette appeared like a blade, slicing her memories wide open. His gait, his shoulders, even the way he tilted his head as if avoiding sunlight, all painfully the same. Vanessa froze, her blood turning cold in an instant, then burning hot as though lit from the inside. Everything around her blurred until there was only him, Doug, standing there, undeniably alive, not a phantom, not a hallucination, not a cruel trick of grief. She moved forward as if pulled by an invisible force, hands trembling like she might drop the entire world, her eyes threatening to shatter with the fragile belief that fate had handed her a chance to make things right, a chance to say what she never had the time to say before he plunged into the abyss. But when the distance between them shrank to only a few steps, Doug turned around and looked straight at her with an emptiness so chilling it felt unnatural, as though she were a stranger who had wandered into his life by accident. Vanessa went numb, as if her soul had been slapped clean out of her body, because that moment didn't feel like a miracle, it felt like a sentence. There was no hesitation in him, no flicker of recognition, no sign of someone who had loved her, suffered for her, died for her. He simply brushed past her and kept walking, calm enough to make Vanessa feel like she was the one losing her mind. In that brief slice of time, every horrifying possibility swarmed her like a flock of crows. Doug had been injured so severely, he'd lost his memory. Doug was running from something more vicious than death itself. Or Doug had never died at all, he'd been hidden away by someone, turned into a piece on a board. And when Vanessa rushed to follow with her eyes, she realized the most terrifying part of all. Doug wasn't alone. Across the street, a black car sat parked, like an ugly smear of ink deliberately dragged across an everyday scene. It didn't belong here. Didn't belong to a peaceful afternoon, it belonged to staged disasters, deals made in darkness, secrets that needed to stay locked away. The car door cracked open, then shut again so quickly most people would have thought they imagined it, but Vanessa didn't. She saw the shape inside, motionless, a face swallowed by shadow like someone who didn't need light to exist. And in that instant, love was ripped out of Vanessa's chest and replaced by something far more violent. Rage. Rage at being deceived. Rage at being turned into a mourner for a corpse that might never have existed. Rage at the thought that every night she sobbed until she couldn't breathe, every morning she forced a smile through pitying stares, might have been nothing more than a scene in a game she wasn't allowed to understand. She wanted to run to him, to grab Doug's hand, to force him to look at her and remember, but something in that hollow stare pinned her in place. Not because she believed he truly didn't remember, but because she was afraid. Afraid that if he was acting, that performance was armor. And armor only exists when the threat is large enough to kill. Vanessa understood Fairmont Crest's rules better than anyone. The wealthy don't kill with guns. They kill with silence, contracts, bribed police, reasonable accidents, and lives erased clean from the record. Doug had never been the kind of man to bow to forces like that. Doug had once believed the truth always had an exit. But if he looked through Vanessa as though she meant nothing, then perhaps the truth had been strangled so tightly Doug had to pretend he had no memories just to keep breathing. Vanessa turned back toward the cafe as a survival reflex. She needed air, walls, a place to think without eyes tracking her every move. But as soon as the door closed behind her, she realized the most sophisticated trap wasn't out on the street. It was inside this staged normalcy. The barista looked at her with mild confusion, as if she'd returned because she'd forgotten her wallet, as if Vanessa's grief was just the problem of a careless customer. She sat at the same table, the one she'd used to convince herself life would go on. And then, as if someone had deliberately left a breadcrumb for her, tucked beneath a napkin was a thin piece of paper, folded in half, with no name attached. She opened it, her fingers shaking so badly she thought she might tear it apart. It contained only one line, an address and the time, written in sharp, steady strokes and hurried, but daring like a message from someone who knew the reader wouldn't be able to ignore it. Vanessa's heart pounded hard enough to hurt. She recognized the feeling immediately, the feeling of being chosen as a pawn. Half of her wanted to rip the paper up on the spot, drop it into her still warm coffee, and pretend she'd never seen it. But the other half, the half scorched by rage and loss, wanted to march straight there as if walking into war, because if Doug was truly alive, she couldn't keep living as someone who'd been fooled, and if Doug was being held under the control of some unseen force, then Vanessa couldn't keep playing the fragile woman who only knew how to mourn. She left the cafe again, and this time she wasn't trembling before a miracle. She was a woman so humiliated she had nothing left to lose. But after only a few steps, her phone buzzed, an unknown number. Vanessa didn't want to answer, because she had no energy left for mysteries, yet something compulsive made her pick up. There was no voice, only a soft, deliberate breath, as if someone wanted Vanessa to hear that she was being watched. Then the line went dead. No threats, no insults, just a signal. And that signal was more frightening than 1,000 curses, because it said the other person was close. Close enough to be confident they didn't need to explain anything. Vanessa drove home in a daze, half awake and half drowning. She kept checking the rearview mirror, not because she feared an accident, but because she feared being shoved into one. Every intersection felt like danger. Every car behind her could have been that black vehicle. And as her thoughts spiraled, one name rose up like a stain she couldn't wash away. Joey. Joey had been by her side in her darkest days, to perfectly timed, to patient, to gentle in a way that had once felt like salvation. Joey spoke of Doug as a tragedy that needed to be sealed shut, tugged Vanessa out of the pit with comfort measured precisely so she wouldn't fall apart. But if Doug was alive, was that gentleness still rescue, or was it a velvet trap noose? The truth flared inside Vanessa like fire. She began replaying every small detail. The moments Joey vanished whenever she tried to dig deeper. The way he tensed when she mentioned powerful names. The times he accidentally knew things he shouldn't have known. Vanessa had once blamed herself for paranoia, told herself grief was making her unstable. But now that grief sharpened into an arrow, pointing straight at the blank spaces in the story. A man like Joey could love for real. He could also use love like a tool. And what disgusted Vanessa most was this: she didn't know whether she wanted Joey innocent or guilty. If he was innocent, then Doug truly abandoned her behind that empty stare, and fate was simply cruel. But if Joey was guilty, Vanessa would at least have someone to hate, a target to fight. Sometimes people cling to hatred because it's easier to breathe than despair. Night fell like a trap snapping shut. Vanessa stood in her living room, the yellow light turning everything into a stage for a sick performance. She opened a drawer and pulled out the pieces she'd packed away like fragments of her former life. The watch Doug used to wear, an old photograph, a hospital bill linked to the crash, She stared at the lines, the numbers, the signatures like a reluctant detective forced to decode her own existence. And then she saw what didn't belong. A transfer fee she'd never understood. A confirmation signature she didn't recognize. A smudged stamp that looked deliberately rubbed out. Someone had interfered with the paperwork from the very beginning. Someone had turned Doug into a file that could be rewritten at will. Vanessa's rage stopped being an emotion and became instinct. She found herself hating Doug for looking through her like she was nothing. Hating herself for believing. Hating Joey for standing so close to her grief. But deeper than all of it, she hated the system of Fairmont Crest, the place where everything could be bought. Where death could be reduced to a breaking news headline. Where a person could vanish without leaving an echo beyond a few tears from those left behind. She had once thought she was weak. But that night Vanessa understood something brutal. Weakness is only the stage before a person explodes. And she was approaching that explosion. The next morning, Vanessa went to the address written on the paper. It was an old building on the edge of the luxury district, close enough to remain within the reach of the powerful, far enough that whatever happened inside could be dismissed as irrelevant. No sign out front, only a metal door and security cameras staring down like cold eyes. Vanessa didn't knock, didn't wait for permission. She went in with the recklessness of someone who had already died once inside her own pain. No one came out to meet her. Only a long corridor. Damp air mixed with antiseptic, as if it had once been a hospital or a warehouse for secrets. Vanessa kept walking, each step heavy as a hammer, until she heard a faint sound at the far end, not crying, not calling, but metal tapping metal, like someone picking a lock or forcing a door open. She stopped, her heart panicking, danger thick around her. Then the door at the end of the corridor swung wide. Doug stepped out, not the distant image from the street, but Doug in flesh and bone, close enough for Vanessa to see the fine veins at his wrist, the fresh scar on his forehead, the way his body had thinned, his eyes darkened like someone who'd been living inside a prison with no bars. In that moment, Vanessa couldn't breathe. Happiness, rage, grief, hatred surged through her all at once, along with something even more horrifying. The feeling of betrayal from the man she loved. Because even though Doug was alive, he didn't run to her, didn't collapse, didn't break open with emotion. He stood there like a locked door. His gaze swept over her, still empty, still distant, but this time Vanessa caught something flicker beneath it. Quick as a flame being smothered. Fear. Doug was afraid of her. Or Doug was afraid of what stood behind her. Vanessa started to step forward, but then she heard footsteps behind her. Not one person, several. They didn't speak, but their shoes striking the floor sounded like a countdown. Vanessa turned and saw silhouettes of people who didn't bother hiding their faces because they believed no one would dare accuse them. And among them, standing slightly back, calm and familiar enough to crush her insides, was Joey. He didn't need to explain. His presence was a confession. Vanessa felt herself fall into a bottomless pit. Every day she'd leaned on Joey to survive. Every moment she'd trusted him to help her stand again, turn to ash. Yet what drove her truly mad wasn't the betrayal alone, it was the war inside her. Part of her wanted to tear into Joey, to turn pain into violence, to take back her dignity through revenge. Another part of her was strangled by the new reality. If Joey was here, then Doug's life and death were in his hands. And if Doug was being held captive, the more Vanessa reacted, the more Doug could be punished. She looked at Doug again. In his eyes was something like a wordless plea, not for love, but for silence. In that instant, Vanessa understood Doug might not have lost his memory at all. He was surviving. He was playing the stranger so Vanessa wouldn't be dragged into the hunt. But she was already dragged in. She was standing in the beast's den, and the cruelest trick of a manipulator is that they don't have to kill right away. They can simply wait and watch their victims destroy themselves. Vanessa left that building without remembering how she got out. She only remembered Doug looking at her one last time. Guilt and desperation tangled in his gaze, like a farewell, before he was pulled back into darkness. She only remembered Joey, never touching her, He didn't have to because he had already touched her life for too long. And now he stood there like someone who owned her pain. On the drive home, Vanessa vomited on the side of the road, not from sickness, but because her body couldn't endure the truth. That night, she sat in the dark with the lights off. She no longer believed in light. She began rewriting every fragment in her mind like an indictment. Doug wasn't dead. The accident was a cover. The records were altered. Joey was involved. A force powerful enough existed to manufacture a legal death. And the coldest thought of all was this: if they could do it to Doug, they could do it to anyone. Vanessa realized she was facing the most brutal choice of her life: stay silent and let Doug keep living inside an invisible prison, or speak out and save him while killing him all over again, destroying herself too, because she would be poking a nest of people who never forgive anyone who exposes their secrets. Vanessa's rage no longer aimed at a single person, it turned toward everything. Toward Doug for choosing silence instead of trusting her, toward Joey for turning her into a puppet, toward herself for loving the wrong man, trusting the wrong hands, and letting grief make her dependent. She wanted to burn it all down, to drag Fairmont Crest into the same abyss Doug had fallen into. But at the same time, her hands shook with fear. Fear Doug would disappear again. Fear she would be the next person erased from the record. Fear that this war was one she could never win, because her enemy wasn't standing alone. The next morning, Vanessa decided to confront Joey, not to ask, not to beg, but to stare straight into the monster she had allowed into her life. She didn't prepare speeches, because words meant nothing anymore. She prepared only one thing: cold, sharpened clarity. But when she arrived, Joey wasn't there. The apartment was empty. Everything had been cleared away, as if no one had ever lived there at all. Vanessa stood in that emptiness and felt herself struck again. Joey hadn't just betrayed her, he had vanished before she could strike back. He seized control first. He left her alone with questions and terror. In that moment, Vanessa understood the cruelty of the game. Joey wanted her to unravel. He wanted her to lose control and destroy herself. He wanted her to chase Doug, so she would become bait that flushed Doug out of hiding. Or he wanted her to stay silent out of fear, so Doug would remain trapped inside his stolen identity forever. And the most painful truth was this: no matter what she chose, she was still playing by someone else's rules. But if pain had taught Vanessa one thing, it was that when someone is pushed to the edge, they stop being a victim, they become a wound. Vanessa stopped thinking about living peacefully. She started thinking about tearing masks away. She began looking back at everyone who had once stood close to Doug, everyone who had reason to want him gone. Not just Joey, not just some faceless force, but also the ones who seemed harmless, the people with polished smiles, the ones who called Doug a friend and Vanessa a little sister, who might have signed their death sentence with a handshake. Then the next shock hit like an explosion inside silence. When Vanessa came home, a bouquet of white flowers sat at her door. No card, no name, only a black ribbon. White flowers were for the dead. Vanessa stared at them as ice crawled up her spine. This wasn't an apology. It was a reminder that death was always waiting at the threshold. She stepped inside, heart hammering, and saw an envelope on the dining table. Inside was a photograph. Doug stood beside a woman Vanessa didn't recognize, holding a small child in his arms. Doug wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the child. His eyes were so soft, Vanessa nearly collapsed. And in the corner of the photo was a date. It was the day Doug died. Vanessa sank to the floor, unable to hold herself up. She was killed again, not by an accident, but by the truth that while she was mourning him, he had been living another life. And whether he'd been forced into it or chosen it, whether he was protecting someone or hiding something, Vanessa still felt abandoned. This pain was different from every pain before it. It wasn't only loss, it was humiliation, because it suggested she might not have been the center of Doug's story at all. She was simply the part that could be cut away. The rage inside Vanessa became uncontrollable. It was a storm. It was a scream inside her ribs. It made her want to shred the photograph, smash the house apart, run into the night and do something reckless enough to end it. But then she stopped, because somewhere in the last surviving corner of her mind, Vanessa understood this could be the manipulator's final blow. The photograph might be real, but it might also be a weapon designed to break her. When someone wants to extinguish a person who is beginning to rise, they don't only threaten them, they poison their sense of worth. They make you doubt you were ever truly loved. They make you believe you are a joke, that fighting is pointless. Vanessa sat there for a long time, and in that stillness a decision formed, like a blade being sharpened. She would not rush into the trap with raw emotion anymore. She would not let rage turn her into a pawn that self-destructed. If Doug was alive, she would uncover the truth in a way the puppeteer couldn't predict. If Doug was acting, she would force him to stop acting with her, even if that meant becoming someone he feared. And if Joey truly stood behind it all, Vanessa would not only take revenge for herself, she would take revenge for the days she had lived like a corpse. She stood up, wiped her face, and stared at the photograph again. The child in the picture was a key, the woman was a lead, and the date was a provocation. Vanessa understood the war had only just begun, and it would not end with a reunion embrace or a gentle explanation. It would end in blood, in someone's collapse, in a new loss that could not be undone. In the end, Vanessa did something that even frightened her. She emailed the photograph to herself, saved multiple copies like insurance. Then she wrote one single line on a slip of paper and tucked it into her bag. If she vanished, people would have to look at this photo. She was preparing for the worst, because she understood the people behind the game did not fear the truth. They only feared the truth falling into the right hands, and Vanessa had just turned herself into those hands. That night, as Vanessa turned off the lights, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was Doug's. Impossible. Doug couldn't be calling, but the screen lit up like a blade plunged straight into her heart. Vanessa stood frozen, hands shaking, unable to answer, unable to reject. One call alone was enough to shatter every plan. And in the moment she hesitated, the call ended on its own. A text appeared, only 4 words, cold enough to make Vanessa want to scream, until her throat tore open. "Don't look for me." Vanessa stared at the screen, tears refusing to fall because she had no tears left. Only a scorched emptiness. Those 4 words weren't a rejection, they were a warning. They were proof Doug still remembered, still knew, was still being controlled, and they meant Doug had just slammed shut the only door Vanessa still had hope for. But Vanessa was no longer a woman of hope. She was a woman of rage, and in the exact second the screen went dark, that rage hardened into a silent vow. If Doug could not come back, she would drag the one pulling the strings into the light, even if it cost her the last piece of humanity she still had left, because the biggest shock had not arrived yet, and Vanessa was beginning to understand that Doug might not be the only person hidden in this game. He might be the next one to disappear.